Thank you, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. I'm Lizette Ocampo, Political Director for People for the American Way, and I lead our Latinos Vote outreach program. We're very excited to share with you new Latino vote numbers based on election simulations for key states. Our aim is to identify when and where the Latino vote has the potential to be pivotal to the outcome of the election under a range of credible scenarios. Today, you'll hear from Ben Jealous, President of People for the American Way, Dolores Huerta, PIFA board member and legendary civil and labor rights leader, Stephanie Valencia, co-founder and president of EquisLabs, and Carlos Odio, co-founder and senior vice president of EquisLabs, about electoral simulations and Latino vote numbers and why they are so critical. And now, I'd like to turn it over to Ben.
Hi, I'm Ben Jealous, President of People for the American Way. It's a real honor to be working with Equis on this project. And it's a sad moment for our country as we mourn the loss of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And yet, everything about this moment reminds us that there's a tyrant in the White House who we have to remove. And the only way that we remove him in our democracy, which we cherish so much, is to build a coalition of voters that wins 270 electoral votes. There's no way for us to do that without a high proportion of Latino voters voting against Trump and for Biden and Harris. So we, under the leadership of our Lizette Ocampo, head of Latinos Vote, and our board member, Dolores Huerta, who years ago push People to really get engaged in competing for Latino swing voters in battleground states, have partnered with Equis to help make it clear just how important in this moment it is that we compete for every Latino vote in this country. That is my pleasure and honor to introduce our board member, the great Dolores Huerta.
Thank you very much, President Ben. I really appreciate that introduction. And thank you, Lizette, and thank you, Stephanie Valencia, all of us that are here together on this wonderful webinar that we're having right now. Yes, absolutely, the Latino vote is so critical because we think of the Southwest and we think of, we think California, New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, these places we have large numbers of Latinos. But we often forget that there are other places like North Carolina, Georgia, New York State, and of course, Florida, where we have huge numbers of Latinos right now and enough Latinos there that can definitely make the difference. And we proved that in the state of Virginia, where Latinos only comprise about maybe 8% of the vote, where the Latino vote was absolutely critical in getting both Governor Northcamp elected and Terry McAuliffe elected. The Latino vote was very critical in doing this. And People for the American Way, I think, and I'm so proud to say that because I am on the board, it was their initiative to go into Virginia and not only on the air with ads, but also on the ground that made that difference. And so we do have a winning formula that People for the American Way, under the leadership of Lizette Ocampo, former Executive Director Michael Keegan, and now with Ben Jealous as our leader, that we can actually execute this really effective plan that we have for getting out the Latino vote. Yeah, we like to say, yes, we can, sí se puede.
Thank you so much, Dolores. We are so honored to have you join us, and thank you so much for your leadership over the years with People for the American Way, and especially leading our Latinos Vote efforts in multiple states. We'd now like to turn it over to EquisLabs to further chat about this work, and I will turn it over to Stephanie Valencia, co-founder and just general visionary leader. Thanks so much, Stephanie.
Thanks so much, Lisette, and thank you, Ben and Dolores, for your collaboration on this project. Just to state the obvious, in acknowledging the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg this weekend, there really is no better way for us to honor her legacy than to fight like hell. And we can do that by having an unquestionable outcome of this election this fall. and with unquestionable, record turnout. It will matter to who sits on the Supreme Court and for countless other judicial nominations in our progressive policy agenda moving forward. And so in these last 40 plus days, we have to put it all on the line. Let me just start by saying that Carlos and I started EquisLabs and EquisResearch, a progressive research, analysis, and experimentation hub a little over a year ago to create a better understanding of the Latino electorate. Knowing that there would be 32 million eligible Latino voters in 2020, we knew that any way you cut it, the path to 270, the path to winning back the Senate, the path to keeping the House runs through the Latino community. So whether it is the Latino bellwether states of Arizona, Nevada, and Florida, or the boost that Latino voters can provide in places like Michigan, Wisconsin, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania, Latinos are a core path to victory this election cycle and cannot be ignored. But with only 43 days until election day, and as we like to, remind ourselves, voting is already underway in some states and people are being mailed ballots very soon. EquisResearch just completed its latest round of research in 5 critical battleground states: Arizona, Florida, Nevada, Colorado, and North Carolina. All of those top lines and crosstabs can be found at Equis, EQUIS, research.us/polls. But building off of those numbers, we work to pull together these election simulations in several key states to help take that polling a step further, to help create a roadmap for work in these closing days of the election cycle. Our aim is to identify where the Latino vote has the potential to be pivotal to the outcome of the election, helping campaigns and funders and others make wise resource allocation decisions and contextualizing the polling for other observers to understand what it's actually going to take to win that sweet spot, important sweet spot. But really importantly, these simulations are a plan for worst case scenarios. We're looking at where Latino support and turnout needs to be relative to other critical parts of the electorate, whether that's the African-American electorate or other parts of the electorate that we need to build a coalition to win in these states. So we want to make those in critical investments now. We are ringing an alarm bell now, rather than in the last 2 weeks of October when we have a lot fewer levers to actually, employ to be able to deal with the natural twists and turns of the last days of a volatile election cycle. So the investment in this community needs to be now in order to ensure that we cement in, the support and high levels of turnout that we need to see to have an unquestionable outcome. A couple of just really important notes before I turn it over to Carlos. You've heard us say this 1,000 times, and we will say it 1,000 times again. The Latino electorate is not a monolith, and in no place do we see that more clearly than it varies in these state simulations. It's always really easy to try to package up a national story about the Latino vote nationally and what are Latinos doing collectively. But the truth is there is no one-size-fits-all approach here. Every state is very, very different and distinct, and the path to victory in every state is very different. These simulations incorporate different assumptions, some of which are kind of imperfect because of how we collect data. But the nuance, the bigger point here is the nuance of the electorate will become fairly evident to you as we go through these simulations. So with that, I will turn it over to Carlos.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. Great to be on with Ben and Dolores in this legendary panel. We're going to look today at takeaways from 5 states where we did these simulations, show the different ways in which the Latino vote comes into play. Next slide. First, a note on what this is and what it isn't. As mentioned, these are simulations. Our aim is to identify when and where the Latino vote has the potential to be pivotal to the outcome of the elections. This is both to help campaigns, funders, in their resource allocation decisions. It's also to help contextualize polling that is coming out for other observers, including folks in the press, such as yourselves. What this isn't, this is not 538, this is not The Economist. We are not trying to make predictions about the ultimate outcome. We are just trying to show in the most transparent way possible a very wide range of scenarios so that we can plan ahead. So we can plan today on things that we can't make up the difference for as we get late into October, as Stephanie said. This was done with the teams at EquisResearch and Labs in partnership with PFAL, with Lizette's great leadership and her idea on this, and with our partners at Target Smart, who are part of our polling team and also a data analytics firm. Next, some points here toward understanding the simulations, and then we'll jump in on the states. One thing is, again, to be transparent, the data on the racial composition of the electorate is all over the place. The estimates come from various sources. It's hard to peg down for any given year what % of the electorate was Latino or non-Latino Black, much less as you get into smaller categories. And so that's just a word of caution as we look at these. In a place like Pennsylvania, for just 1 year, like 2016, you have estimates that range from 2% to 6% of the share of the electorate being Latino. Those are very wide and really impact our potential simulations now. And so as we talk about the range of Latino vote share, it's important to both understand that as we talk about turnout, there's real world actual shifts in turnout, but then there's also shifts that are important in the assumptions made by pollsters and analysts that also can impact the top line results you see coming out of a given state. I'll try to be less wonky from this point on, but that is important to mention. Next slide. And then as you read the tables, very straightforward. Where you see green, that is a win for Biden. Where you see red, that is a loss for Biden. That is a scenario in which there's a loss for Biden. What we did is, as Hispanic vote share increases in a given state, we decreased white share. For purposes of this exercise, we kept the share of non-Hispanic Black voters and other groups in the electorate fixed, constant. So that you could see how the dynamism of the Latino vote within this context. But it's important to note that because as we talk about potential gaps, those gaps don't necessarily need to be filled by the Latino vote. They can also be filled by increased performance among Black or AAPI voters, for example. So just to keep that in mind, that is not to minimize the importance, but to try to place the Latino vote in context. We had to do some simplifications that aren't very perfect. Next slide. And then last note, when we give any kind of number of Democratic support, Biden support, it's two-way support, which is just to say, so you don't get confused if you've seen a lot of our polling, why it looks different. We cut out all the undecideds, all the third party, just look at Biden, Trump, or historically Clinton, Trump, or Obama, Romney, and see what % of Democrats get of those two pieces so that you can have more of an apples to apples comparison over time. So a poll might say Biden 60%, but in reality, it's a 75% two-way. That's just, again, a caveat. Let's jump into this. Next slide. So let's start in Arizona. Next slide. Biden needs the Hispanic vote to win in Arizona, even in the most optimistic white vote scenarios. Part of what we are trying to ask here is, today, the polling might look good. If the white vote starts to drop in any way, if it starts to regress to more of a mean, what does it mean in terms of the rest of the electorate and particularly Latino side? So right now, our current polling puts Biden in a fairly strong position as long as white support remains high. This is a scenario pulled from an average of current public polling for Biden among white voters. You see both Biden and Mark Kelly, those are the two dotted lines, in the win scenario narrowly if white support holds where it is today, given where they are polling among Latinos and where we expect that Latino turnout might end up. But, next slide, if white support starts to drop back towards previous levels, it becomes critical for Biden to push up both Hispanic support and turnout. So in this scenario, which is 2018 levels of white support, the Sinema election, Biden would currently lose the state, and Mark Kelly would be in a very, very tight race. For both of them, it would become incredibly critical to have increased their margins, even a few points with the Latino electorate. And then next slide, if you slip to where a generic Democrat was polling just in 2019. So we've seen a lot of increase toward Biden in the last year. But if you see the white vote go back to where it was even a year ago, you have a much, much tighter scenario where only the highest levels of Latino performance would save Biden. So what we are urging folks is not to be complacent, but to say, let's try to push for those levels now so that we don't find that it's too late in October. Next slide, we're gonna go to Pennsylvania quickly. Given the unique importance of the Black vote in Pennsylvania, we did things differently. We constructed sets of scenarios where you had optimistic Black vote share and others where you had a regression to more 2016 exit poll levels. Our calculations show that Biden would win the state regardless of his performance with Latinos as long as he can keep Black voter turnout and white support above where Clinton was in 2016. So that's optimistic view of Pennsylvania, given a set of scenarios that you might see today. Next slide. But if white support drops back toward 2016, Biden will need both high Black turnout share combined with high levels of Latino support and turnout in order to get a win. Again, the dotted lines represent kind of a credible range of scenarios for Latino vote share at current polling in Pennsylvania that we see for Biden among Latinos. And so within this range, it's essentially a toss-up if white vote drops, which in a place like Pennsylvania is like liable to happen. Next slide, we'll do North Carolina. So again, here is a state where, unlike in Arizona, the Latino electorate is relatively small. And yet what we found is it has the potential to be pivotal under certain conditions. In our simulations, those conditions are a function of two key factors. One, the level of white support, and two, the level of Black vote share, assuming that Biden earns a high level of support from Black voters, which again, we shouldn't fully assume, but for purposes exercise, we will look at. What this chart summarizes is the results of our simulation across a range of those two factors, white support and Black turnout. In pink square scenarios, Biden will lose the state regardless of what happens with the Latino vote. In the blue scenarios, he wins the state even if he does poorly with Latinos. The green boxes is where I draw your attention. Those are scenarios in which Latino vote is pivotal to determining the outcome of the election. So there are actually a number of credible scenarios in which a Biden victory will be contingent on the Latino vote. And it's as white vote share increases into the range where Biden could potentially get a victory, where the Black share of the vote gets somewhere between Clinton 2016 levels and Obama 2008 levels. So as you're nearing a victory, it becomes all the more important what Latino performance looks like at that point in constructing a winning coalition. Next slide. So this is an example. This is a scenario where you do have Biden at 38% of the white vote, which is pulled out of current polling. At that level, the Latino vote becomes highly critical. Even in this optimistic scenario for Black turnout and white support, Biden only wins at the higher end of the Latino turnout range. So again, vertically, as we go deeper down, higher levels of Latino vote share, you're seeing the possibilities of a victory, and yet would lose if his Latino support numbers were to slip at all. So where he's polling right now is pretty high, 73%. If you saw any slippage, even with increased white support and Black turnout, you could see a loss in North Carolina. Critical to also mention U.S. Senate races and the impact of them. In the U.S. Senate race, Cal Cunningham would lose at his current rate of Latino support. He's underperforming, he's at 65%. So important to remember that presidential numbers don't always transfer down ballot. The importance of the U.S. Senate has been driven home for us all over this last weekend. And so not just looking at something like the presidential in North Carolina, but also making sure that there's communication and investment around the U.S. Senate races as well, and not taking that for granted. And then we'll do Nevada and then Florida. We saved Florida for last. I know folks are eager to hear that one. Let's do Nevada. The Latino vote is critical to a Biden win in Nevada in nearly all scenarios we examined, as you might imagine. That said, at his current level of Latino support, which is solid, Biden is well positioned if he can also hold on to the high level of white support that he has enjoyed from the end of 2019 up to the current moment. As you see, we're in the green. But next slide, if white support drops down to what we saw for Obama in 2012, for example, he couldn't afford any slippage in Latino backing, more so if he goes down to 40%, which is the level of white support for Hillary Clinton in 2016 in Nevada. So Biden would still have a path to victory, but it would require him to improve on his current support among Latino voters and maximize turnout in a way that is not a given today. If the election were today, we would not bank on that being the most likely scenario. And then lastly, Florida. If Biden can do as well with white voters as he was polling during the summer, our simulations show him winning the state regardless of his performance with the Latino vote. The very huge caveat there is that Florida will always find a way to be Florida. We have already begun to see that happening in the polling. This is a scenario where Biden gets white support just above what we saw in the midterms for Bill Nelson and Andrew Gillum. If he ends up in this kind of scenario, you see him at his current number doing well, eking out a victory. But if he were to repeat the kind of Hispanic underperformance we saw in 2018, it would result in a narrow loss. Next slide. Meanwhile, if you see a drop to 40%, which is close to a historical average, it's just a bit above the historical average for white support for a Democrat in the state. It is what you saw in 2018, what you also saw Obama get in 2012 when he won the state. We would need to see upticks in support, even modest increases in Latino or frankly Black performance to get over the finish line. But where we are today would not be enough. Again, the differences within the states, the dynamic in Florida, next slide, is one of, let's skip to this. I should say, as Clinton actually performed closer to 34% with the white vote in 2016. If we were at those levels, we wouldn't win regardless of where we get within our current range of Hispanic support. Next slide. Keep going. Florida is so much a story of the subgroups within it. We talk a lot about the Cuban vote. We talk more now about the Puerto Rican vote. There's also 40% of the Hispanic electorate that is neither Cuban nor Puerto Rican. It's Colombian, Dominican, Nicaraguan, Peruvian, Venezuelan, and so forth. Mexican American is actually third on the list by eligibility, fourth by registration. We don't talk about it as much. What is important for Biden to be in range in Florida, he needs to get over the 60% threshold of Latino support. To get there, he will need to maximize his support among non-Cuban Hispanic voters, even if he earns a high level of support from Cubans. And so we talk a lot about the Cubans. It's important to hold the numbers that he's currently in range for, potentially playing a little defense, but it's not one or the other. Even if you get good Cuban support, but don't maximize the non-Cuban vote, then he will not get into the territory we think he needs in order to pull off a victory in the state of Florida. And I'll end there so that we can take questions. I know it's a lot of information, so we want to be able to get to that. We will make sure that you get these slides and can also follow up with any questions you might have on any of the states.
Thank you so much, Carlos, who's one of the top Latino vote experts on data and research in the country, and Stephanie for helping us present that information. And we'll now open it up to questions. So please raise your virtual hand and we can go to questions. First question I see, Susan Milligan, if you can unmute her mic, please.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted. I've become a technological wizard during the pandemic. So can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello? Okay, good. Okay, so Florida, of course, a couple of things. One, when you talk about improving performance among African-American and Latinos, are you talking about turnout or support or both? And secondly, when we've seen some polling, I realize, there was a Monmouth poll that kind of, went the other way, but there was some other polling earlier last week that showed softer support than you would imagine among, sort of I-4 corridor Puerto Ricans. And I'm just wondering why that might be, considering a lot of them, of course, came from the island after Maria, and you would think that they might not feel so fondly toward the president.
Sure. Let me take the first part of that. If anyone wants to weigh in on the Puerto Rican side, I'll let you. I'll say, so part of what we try to show in the simulations is the relationship of support and turnout. So when we talk about performance, it is both. It is not enough to think of the Latino electorate as get out the vote targets. They also must be seen as persuasion targets. In many cases, people are deciding not between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, but between voting and not voting. But the dynamic is the same. To get the kind of levels we need to see, you need to see increases in explicit support for Joe Biden. That has been consistent in all the research that we have done this year. So we are talking both support and mobilization. There's been a lot of polling in Florida. We purposely did not factor in scenarios from polls that had very small sample sizes that we don't think accurately reflect the state of the race there. We have our own 1,000 sample survey that we released in the last few weeks that has Biden up in the teens. The simulations you saw here have us anticipating that Biden will be essentially either above, somewhere between above where Bill Nelson was in 2018, but at max reaching where Clinton got in 2016. That's based on our polling and other credible polling that we have seen. Among Puerto Ricans, Biden still enjoys a very healthy lead among the Puerto Rican voter. What we do see is a lot of just, as we've seen with other electorates, holding back, waiting, don't know yet enough about Joe Biden, not necessarily an increase for Donald Trump. Where there has been a small shift, it has been mostly among men. And that seems to be less a function of the fact that they are Puerto Rican and more a function of the fact that they are younger men. And there's a dynamic of younger men right now in this moment and their support for Donald Trump.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We'll now go to Scott Powers. We can't hear you. Can you unmute Scott Powers, please? Oh, there we go. We cannot
Scott?
hear you. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, Scott, we can't hear you.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, we can't. You might want to. We're having some.
If you want to put your question in the chat, Scott, we could.
There we
do it
go.
that way too.
While we're waiting on that, does anyone else have any additional questions? We have Bianca Padro. We can unmute Bianca, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I just had a quick question about kind of the methodology and how this exercise was kind of conceptualized, and just to understand, you know, I get that this is very different from kind of a poll and that kind of measurement, but can you just give more details on, you know, how this was done?
Sure, I can jump in on this. We, you know, I think that we've been seeing recently more headlines and sort of sounding the alarm that we need to be reaching out to Latino voters. That's what we're saying here. We need investments, we need resources, we need to just be talking to and communicating to Latino voters, because how this election is decided depends on that. And so part of this was, how do we show where and how and what scenarios the Latino vote literally decides the election? And so that's kind of where this idea came from. Let's have a set of electoral simulations so you can see, based on the performance of in several different scenarios, where based on support and turnout levels where they intersect, what we need in terms of Latino voters to win those key states. So that's kind of where the idea came from. And then Carlos took it from there and worked his magic with the data, if you want to kind of talk about that further.
Yeah, and the methodological point. Well, yeah, and I'd say there's a 50% problem that plagues us when people look at the Latino vote, which is, you look at any group in the electorate and you say, is Biden above 50% or below 50%? Above 50 is great, below 50 is bad. But when you're looking at an electorate like the Latino electorate, that's not the right metric. You're in the 60s, people want to know, is that a good number, is it a not good number? And so part of this exercise is just contextualizing it. So what we did is look at scenarios where constructing many different combinations of white vote being a greater share of the electorate versus Latino share versus other share. We then varied support levels for Biden. We then varied, so we've varied support levels in certain states. We varied Black share of the vote, or we varied Black support levels. So we took all these different variables and created a wide range of scenarios to see where are the pieces, what are the vote levels at which Biden pulls off a win versus those in which he loses. We used a combination of our own polling, other public polling, historic data from exit polling, from other data analysis, kind of pulled in everything we possibly could historically to set credible ranges for all of those different variables.
You know, just to kind of drive home that 50% quandary just a bit further, we want to make sure that the only question that really matters for those of us who want to get rid of this tyrant, Donald Trump, and make Biden and Harris president is, are we winning the Latino vote overwhelmingly? People have been kind of stopping, are we winning it? Sure, we're winning it. It doesn't matter unless we win it overwhelmingly. And that's the point of this. The other thing is to get folks to really also focus on Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, to understand that states, far east of California, far north of Florida, have a Latino voter share that's incredibly important. Some of these states, like a state like Wisconsin, where I spent a fair amount of time, it's 6x the margin that Trump won by. The Latino voting population is 6x the margin that Trump won by in Wisconsin. And so we've got to get folks of the mindset that we have to win the Latino vote. It has to be like a super majority of the Latino vote, and it matters in every single state.
We'll now go to Julia Preston.
And then Lizette, in the chat, there's questions from Scott and Griselda and Rita.
Great, thank you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, my question is how much of the polling that you're using is conducted partially or entirely in Spanish? And how important is it to have Spanish language polling be part of the data set for calculating the Latino votes, particularly in Florida?
Well, I'll let Carlos take this question here in the details of it, but I think, Julia, one of the biggest takeaways and part of why we started Equis research was we were seeing either a dearth of good Latino polling, or Latino polling wasn't really happening until late in the election cycle. And we know that there's a lot of, in addition to there being, nuance in the electorate, to really tap into that nuance of the electorate, you have to do the polling in a way that will reach and solicit the opinions of the diversity of the electorate. And so, all of our polling that we do at Equis Research is multimodal, done in, both English and Spanish, leveraging a lot of the strengths of pollsters who know how to do this work and who have polled in the community for a very long time. Otherwise, we are left with, the kind of the crumbs of, national polls with samples of 138 people in a state as diverse as Florida, that help to, create some, quite frankly, some of the panic and confusion about the Latino vote. But I'll let Carlos talk a little bit more about the sampling and specifically Spanish language in Florida.
Yeah, it's a great question. I should say for polling on Latino voters, we use our own polling, which is multimodal, bilingual at all times. And the reason it's so important to include Spanish speakers, as we've seen in our data analyzing it, is that a Spanish speaker, someone who prefers to take the interview in Spanish, actually looks very different than someone who prefers to see it in English. Both Latino, but one who chooses to opt in Spanish is fundamentally different, not just in the sense that maybe they're more democratic or less democratic, but that a Republican who prefers English interview to one who prefers Spanish interview is themselves very different. A Hispanic Republican who speaks Spanish is less Trump supporting. Interestingly, on ideology, what we saw is that Spanish speakers are less polarized, meaning the liberals are less liberal, the conservatives are less conservative, and the moderates are less, the independents are less moderate. You see more of a flattening. And so you're seeing a fundamentally different voter. In Florida, it's different. A Spanish speaker in Florida is more likely to be Republican and Trump supporting across party ID. Even the Democrats who speak Spanish are more likely to be Trump supporting than those who answer in English. And so that is why it's so critical to get a mix of language as well as modes. We poll online and phone, cell and line, because we're trying to reach deep into the electorate, into folks who traditionally have been harder to poll and reach.
Thank you. And I have Scott Powers' question here. I'm going to read it. I know it is late breaking and wouldn't have been a factor until now, but do you have any thoughts on what happens with the Florida Latino vote and nationally if Donald Trump picks Barbara Lagoa as a Supreme Court appointment?
Well, I'm not going to put her on the spot, but I would love to hear Dolores on this question of Barbara Lagoa's impact. I think what we will say is we haven't polled it yet, so we don't have an answer. We hope to poll it soon and have more data on that question.
Well, we do know that the abortion issue is an issue that we have among Latino Catholics and many evangelicals. But on the other hand, I think we have to balance out the attacks that have been, directed at the Latino community, and that people are still feeling the pain of those attacks. And I think that is going to be up to us to try to balance that out so that people can really see that, and keep talking to Latino, not to let their religion determine how they're going to be voting in November. It could be an issue, but we'll see how we have to handle it. I don't think that will overcome, as I said before, the vicious attacks that have been vetted against the Latino community, for the last 4 years. And so, it's up to us to kind of remind people that the way that they are able to respond to the attacks is by voting, and by voting for Biden and Kamala.
I think the one I would just add here, and as Carlos mentioned, we haven't polled on this topic yet, but there's no question that Republicans and conservatives will try to weaponize abortion in these closing days, along with the Supreme Court nomination. And what we actually have seen among Latino voters in some of our earlier rounds of polling is Latino voters may be actually more pro-choice than conventional wisdom suggests. When we did a kind of traditional pairing of a very pro-choice message versus an anti-choice message, upwards of 60%, 60-65% support for pro-choice messaging among Latino voters, even among church-going Latinos, was even surprising to us. So I do think that, Hispanic Catholics and Latino Catholics, even church-going Catholics, are far more progressive in their ideology than maybe those we've been led to believe to this point.
Thank you. We'll now go to Lauren Gambino. Lauren, your mic is unmuted. We cannot hear you speaking though, so you might want to throw your question in the chat and we can read it.
I'll put it in the chat.
Oh, we can hear you now.
Okay, perfect. I had a very specific question from Arizona. I was just wondering, polling shows Mark Kelly running further ahead than Biden with Latino voters. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on why that is. Is it a lack of, I don't know, why you think that is, and what Biden could do to sort of catch up with where Sinema was in 2018?
Well, I think maybe because during the Hillary campaign, Mark Kelly was very, very visible with his wife, Gabby Gifford, and going throughout the state of Arizona several times in the campaigning. And we know that his wife was a congressional representative from Arizona. So I think that the voters are probably just more familiar with him, and they have more of a relationship with him at this point than they do with Biden. But at the same time, I think that most of the voters will see that Biden is really going to be there for their interests, and certainly Trump has shown that he's not really cares very much about the Latino community.
Well, we can see from some of the television and radio spend data and digital data that we've been tracking at EquisLabs. Mark Kelly has been investing a fair amount of money to communicate to Latinos in Arizona, specifically in Spanish language. And in addition to that, we're starting to see increased spending from the Biden campaign on both Spanish language television and digital. So I think the time period from which our poll was fielded was the really the end of August, and there's obviously been a ton of investment that has been made, a lot of resources dedicated to the state of Arizona and to Florida. So we will be back in the field, in the next couple of weeks, one last time before the election, to get a better understanding of where the electorate is in the final days.
There was the question of the specific numbers for Kelly and McSally in Arizona. So just to address that, so over 5 previous surveys this cycle, we've seen a remarkably stable race between Mark Kelly and Martha McSally in Arizona. It averaged 61 Kelly, 27 McSally, a 34-point edge for the Democrat. It was remarkably static. What we saw in our most recent poll in August, though, is a slight break toward Kelly. McSally's number has not moved. but Mark Kelly is now leading by 39 points, 65-27, which is a healthy lead.
Thank you. And that question was from Giselda Centeno with KTAR News in Phoenix. Giselda, if you have any additional questions on that, let us know. We also have a question from Rita, Rita Portela with Telemundo. Can I have a question answered in Spanish for our station Telemundo 62? We are recording and we need a sound in this is the question. There is a big community of Puerto Ricans in the state, but you said the data shows that the vote of Latinos would not be pivotal if Biden gets the black vote. Is it important enough to make the difference according to your simulations?
The different register. Sino, lo que vemos hoy son altos niveles de apoyo a Biden en Pensilvania entre todo tipo de votantes, sea afroamericano, blanco o latino. Lo que ocurre si el apoyo a Biden entre los votantes blancos vuelve a los niveles que vimos en el 2016, las elecciones de Clinton, es que la combinación del voto afroamericano y el voto hispano serían aún más clave.
Agrego a eso que normalmente hablamos de estados como la Florida y Arizona, pero nosotros vemos que en Pensilvania es muy importante de hablar con los votantes latinos y que pueden decidir la elección. I think that's all the questions we have. Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining today's call. Again, feel free to follow up with any additional questions you may have. Dolores, do you mind closing us out?
Well, we just want to thank everybody that joined us and thank you for your interest in the Latino vote. And we do want to say that the Here People for the American Way, this is very definitely one of our big focuses that we are doing right now. We feel that there needs to be a lot more investment, a lot more resources, a lot more attention being paid to the Latino vote. You know, they have a saying in Spanish that nomás vienen a ver el nopal cuando tiene tunas, you know, that sometimes they only come to visit the cactus when it has fruit, okay? Well, right now we have to say that that fruit is calling for even more attention, more resources, because we do firmly believe that the Latino vote can make a tremendous amount of difference in the election. And so that is what we are aiming for in People for the American Way. And I want to thank President Ben Jealous for keeping to that commitment. And we're going to do everything that we can, you know, to be able to make that happen. And I also want to say I'm really happy to be here with Stephanie Valencia, whom I met many, many years ago in one of another presidential campaign. So thank you all for joining us. And thank you, Carlo, for all of the great information that you've given us. You have really shown and you have proven that, yes, the Latino vote, we can make the difference. And again, thank you, Lizette. And muchas gracias a todos. Thank you all for joining. Si se puede.